Hi, everyone. So in this training, you're going to learn about suicide assessment and really some practical and simple steps that you can take to help prevent suicide. But I want to start off with this video to help you understand some basics about suicide assessment, and really I want to emphasize that suicide assessment is everyone's responsibility. So anyone who is concerned for, cares for a person that might be thinking of suicide, which again will hopefully be all of us, can act as a gatekeeper, as we like to call them, for suicide prevention. And so this is not just for the experts, for the mental health professionals, not just for people specifically trained. We're all invited to take a part in this. And really, it can be done anytime a person exhibits warning signs for suicide. Uh, a suicide assessment should be done, can be done. And although it may sound technical, assessment is a big word, it's really, the idea of it is simple. It means just asking about suicide to determine whether a person is at risk. Now, of course, there's more involved processes that can get done by mental health professionals, but for those of you who are not mental health professionals, it can mean simply doing a screening to determine whether risk is present, whether further assessment is needed. And one of the main goals for suicide prevention is really equipping people with tools for assessment of suicide risk. We know you can't focus resources unless you know who is at higher risk for suicide and for lethal or nearly lethal suicide attempts. And so the goal of assessment is to try to determine where a person falls on a continuum of risk. And it's important to emphasize it's not just about classifying people either as suicidal or non-suicidal. It's thinking of it as a spectrum. The degree of risk can change over that spectrum of suicidality. And so there's lower risk, but potentially of concern. And then there's higher risk where a person might be more imminently suicidal. And the goal really is to provide some assistance where we can determine to some degree that probability of self-harm and suicide. Now, one concern that people often have is rooted in a myth of suicide, that if you ask a person about suicide, it will plant the idea in their head, and if they weren't thinking about it, they will start to consider it. But contrary to this notion, the research has shown if you ask a person about suicide, it's actually a relief for those experiencing suicidal ideation. And for those who are not experiencing thoughts of suicide, they will actually see it as a form of caring because you cared about them enough to ask. And so generally, for those who are thinking of suicide, it's a relief, and those not thinking of it just seems as an act of caring for them. Now, most people are honest about their thoughts if asked directly. Although a small minority may not be entirely forthcoming, they often provide clues of their actual state in other ways. And that's an important part of this process, and one I don't want to gloss over. So again, although most people considering suicide are forthright about their suicidal thoughts, it is possible that those most at risk may not express their intentions clearly. So we know that 57 to 78% of people who go on to die by suicide, studies have shown that if they were asked about their thoughts of suicide in their last clinical contact, again, 57 to 78% will deny it. Oftentimes, that last clinical contact will be less than a week before their suicide. So it is important to consider other factors: anxiety, agitation, sleep disturbance, financial strains, hopelessness, and not rely only on self-reported suicidal thoughts for this reason. 26% of all suicide attempts occurred without any planning. Again, reminding us that while we want to lean into suicide assessment, we also want to have a balanced idea that this is not going to be perfect. It just helps us in this process.